The Galactic Empire did not take notice of every world encountered. It did not waste time on barren rocks, nor did it squander fleets on races too primitive to resist. Yet when its surveyors mapped a blue planet orbiting a modest yellow sun on the edge of a spiral arm, the findings carried an unusual interest. Humanity, the bipedal species that had barely stepped into space, seemed insignificant at first glance. Their weapons were crude, their fleets laughable compared to the armadas of the Empire. Their cities were fragile constructs of steel and glass, lacking the grandeur of the worlds that had been brought under imperial dominion. But there was something curious buried in the data, something that made the geneticists lean closer, made the archivists open forbidden files, and made the rulers of the Empire decide that this species warranted more than passing attention. The humans carried in their bloodline an anomaly. Across their history, they had survived endless plagues, wars, and extinctions. No other species cataloged by the Empire had adapted so quickly to adversity. Where others broke, humanity endured. Where others collapsed, humanity hardened. They had no claws, no fangs, no scales, no armor, yet they thrived in every environment they touched. To the Empire, this resilience was more valuable than any mineral vein or planetary resource. It was something worth dissecting, isolating, and perhaps weaponizing. So when the directive came, it was precise and unyielding. A retrieval team would land in secret, under cover of night, and extract specimens. Not just any humans, but 5 women, all heavy with child. The geneticists argued that the womb held the purest form of human adaptability, unshaped by environment, untouched by war, ready to be rewritten. The unborn could be molded into living weapons, if their potential could be harnessed. To the Empire, they were not people. They were resources, test subjects, raw material. The operation unfolded without resistance. Empire ships moved like shadows across the sky, their hulls bending light, their engines silent to primitive ears. Within minutes, 5 households in scattered corners of Earth lost their daughters, their sisters, their wives. There were no alarms, no warnings, no gunfire. The women vanished as if the night itself had swallowed them. The world slept on, unaware that something immeasurably old had reached into their midst and taken what it desired. The Empire's arrogance was absolute. They believed themselves untouchable, as they had for millennia. Humanity was nothing more than a specimen to be harvested. The captives awoke within sterile chambers of alloy and glass, suspended in fields that restrained their movements without chains. They could see one another through the transparent walls. 5 terrified figures clutching swollen bellies, 5 sets of eyes wide with dread. None spoke the same language, yet fear needed no translation. The Empire's physicians observed them without expression, recording data with instruments that probe beyond flesh and bone. Heart rates, hormone levels, neural activity. Every detail was captured, every reaction cataloged. The women cried, prayed, pleaded. Their voices echoed hollow in a place that had never known mercy. The Empire considered itself the master of biology. It had conquered worlds not just through firepower, but through manipulation of life itself. Species were re-engineered to serve, modified to produce, tailored to fit roles within the grand machinery of conquest. To them, humanity was simply another raw template, a curious deviation in a vast collection of genetic blueprints. They saw no danger, only opportunity. They believed these fragile creatures posed no threat. They believed wrong. For deep within humanity's collective soul lay something the Empire had never accounted for. Something older than empires, older than fleets, older than science. Humanity carried with it not only resilience but the weight of its stories, its myths, its nightmares. Across millennia, around fires and in shadows, humans had whispered of figures that embodied their fears. Creatures of legend that punished the arrogant, hunted the cruel, and answered to no master. To the Empire, they were fairy tales. To humanity, they were something far more. The abduction stirred more than fear in the women. It awakened echoes buried deep in their bloodlines. Each mother-to-be carried not just a child, but heritage threaded with stories told by countless generations before them. Stories of the witch who dwelled in the woods, who devoured those who strayed too far from the safety of home. Stories of the shadow that crept into rooms at night, punishing the wicked, reminding all that darkness could not be ignored. These were not idle tales. They were survival mechanisms, born of millennia of struggle, sharpened into weapons of the psyche. When the Empire took those women, they did not just seize flesh. They brushed against the edge of something they could not comprehend. The first signs came quietly. A technician monitoring neural scans noticed spikes that made no sense. Patterns of brain activity surged not only in the women, but also in their unborn children. The readings suggested communication, faint, primal, but undeniable. The fetuses responded to each other as though linked, despite being isolated in separate chambers. The data was dismissed as interference. Equipment could fail, after all, and human biology was still poorly understood. Yet when systems across the lab began to stutter, when consoles flickered and lights dimmed in places no fault should reach, unease began to whisper through the ranks of the Empire's staff. The women dreamed, not the simple dreams of exhausted captives, but shared visions that rippled across their minds. In sleep, they walked forests darker than night, where a crooked hut on chicken legs loomed in shifting fog. In those dreams, a crone's laughter rasped through the trees, promising vengeance, promising protection. At the same time, other visions took them into endless corridors where footsteps followed close but never showed a source, where a cold breath whispered that punishment always came, even to those who believed themselves untouchable. They woke in tears, trembling and yet strangely hardened. The fear had not broken them. It had given them something to cling to. The Empire noticed a change. Stress levels should have risen, but instead, the women's vitals began to stabilize. They no longer begged. They no longer wept. Their eyes held a defiance the physicians could not explain. In their arrogance, the overseers dismissed it as human stubbornness, a minor inconvenience before the scalpel and the gene sequencer. They failed to see that the myths of humanity were not harmless stories. They were armor. They were weapons. They were the language of survival written into the marrow of the species. As the days stretched into weeks, incidents multiplied. Guards reported seeing shadows where none should exist, feeling watched in corridors that should have been secure. One officer swore he heard footsteps behind him, heavy and deliberate, but when he turned, the hallway was empty. Another spoke of a whisper that slid into his thoughts, a woman's voice promising that he would never see the dawn. He laughed it off, but the next day he was gone, his post abandoned, his belongings left behind. Surveillance revealed nothing. Cameras showed only static in the moments he disappeared. The official reports blamed desertion. Quietly, fear began to grow. The Empire had always believed itself beyond fear. Its fleet spanned thousands of systems. Its armies crushed resistance with precision and calculation, and its rulers sat upon thrones of cold certainty. Fear was a tool it inflicted upon others, not something it felt. But when the 5 women continued to change within their chambers, when instruments failed and whispers haunted the halls, the cracks began to spread. Fear crept in like frost through the hull, unseen but unstoppable. And from those cracks, something older than the Empire itself began to pour. The pregnancies accelerated beyond all precedent. Weeks felt like months. Cells divided, minds formed, and what should have been helpless fetuses stirred with awareness. Patterns in their neural activity defied explanation, not random sparks of life, but deliberate pulses, almost as though the unborn were communicating in codes older than language. The scientists whispered of anomalies, but the soldiers guarding the chambers whispered of something else entirely. They spoke of shadows moving inside the glass when no one was inside, shapes older than the women themselves, shifting just beyond sight. Some refused their posts. Others kept their rifles close, though they knew rifles meant nothing against things they could not understand. The Empire continued its experiments. Probes pushed deeper into wombs, genetic samplers stripped fragments of DNA, invasive scans burned with invisible light. Yet for every intrusion, the resistance grew stronger. The women no longer flinched. Their eyes followed physicians with quiet contempt, a contempt that carried weight heavier than any words. When one of the unborn was subjected to a high-intensity scan meant to force neural reactions, the lights across the entire facility failed for 13 seconds. In that darkness, every soldier felt breath on the back of their necks. When illumination returned, one of the senior scientists was gone. His console still glowed. His chair still spun, but he had vanished as though erased, leaving only the faint smell of burning pine and wet soil where no trees had ever grown. It was the first direct strike. It would not be the last. The shadows that haunted the facility coalesced into something sharper. Baba Yaga stirred first, for she had always lingered close to those who bore life within them. The women's dreams fed her, called her, and shaped her arrival. Soon, her presence was not confined to nightmares. Soldiers found corridors stretched impossibly long, the walls groaning, as if lined with ancient wood, doors open into forests that could not exist, trees twisting where steel bulkheads should have been. The air smelled of moss and rot, of smoke from unseen fires, of death waiting patiently among roots older than stars. Those who strayed too far into these illusions did not return. When search teams entered, they found only boot prints leading into trees before stopping abruptly, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. The Empire's officers insisted these were hallucinations, tricks of stress and exhaustion. Yet the missing remained missing, and the forest kept growing. No matter how much metal they welded, no matter how many barriers they erected, the darkness returned. The ship carried a piece of Earth's oldest woods within its heart, and within that forest walked the crooked shadow of the witch who had outlived nations. She did not reveal herself fully. She never had to. The sound of her mortar grinding, the silhouette of her hut shifting between dimensions, the cackle that came from nowhere and everywhere at once, these were enough to unmake even the strongest soldiers. If Baba Yaga was chaos incarnate, then what came next was inevitability sharpened into a blade. The American Boogeyman did not arrive with forests or illusions. He arrived in silence. Where Baba Yaga tore the edges of reality, the Boogeyman slipped into its cracks. Soldiers vanished without sound, their rifles clattering to the floor long before anyone noticed their absence. Officers woke to find the walls of their quarters marked with handprints, dark and greasy, even though security had never been breached. Messages appeared in systems thought secure, words typed into consoles with no source. I see you. Surveillance cameras captured fleeting frames of movement in empty corridors, a figure tall and featureless, gone before anyone could blink. The Boogeyman was not flesh. He was inevitability, the certainty that judgment always arrived, whether expected or not. His presence was less spectacle and more infection. Paranoia spread like fire. No one trusted the shadows anymore. No one trusted their own eyes. Every creak of metal was his step. Every flicker of light was his arrival. The Empire had always dismissed human myths as nonsense, but myths are weapons shaped over centuries of survival. Humanity had built Baba Yaga to embody nature's cruelty, and the Boogeyman to embody society's justice. Now both stood unleashed, were in the corridors of the Empire as hunting grounds. Entire squads refused deployment. Engineers sealed themselves into compartments, only to be found dead hours later with expressions of sheer terror etched across their faces, untouched by any weapon. Pilots abandoned their stations, convinced that shadows had followed them even into the cockpit. In response, commanders tightened discipline, issuing threats, promising punishment. Yet every order echoed hollow. What punishment could outweigh the fear already seizing their throats? Fear had become the master of the Empire. Humanity had never needed fleets or weapons. All it needed was the darkness it had carried in its heart since the first fire was lit against the cold night. The 5 women, once prisoners, became something more. Their bodies glowed faintly under certain wavelengths, their pulses synchronized with patterns in the ship's failing systems. When the guards approached, they felt not pity but dread, as though looking into faces that carried judgment from worlds beyond. The unborn within them kicked with unnatural strength, their movements resonating through the air like distant drums. It was no longer 5 individuals, no longer 5 pregnancies. It was one storm, one chorus, one inevitable reckoning given flesh. The Empire tried to contain it. Commanders ordered the use of suppression fields, chemical restraints, and psychic dampeners. None succeeded. The more they pushed, the stronger the resistance grew. When dampeners activated, soldiers lost time, staring into nothingness before waking with blood on their hands and no memory of what they had done. When chemicals were injected, the vials shattered, shards embedding into the skin of those who had dared approach. It was as though the myths themselves rejected interference, punishing those who thought they could cage them. Rumors spread among the crew. They whispered that the women were not captives, but queens, avatars of forces that had chosen humanity as their vessel. They whispered that the unborn were not children, but warriors, destined to lead an uprising that would unmake empires. They whispered that Baba Yaga had already claimed the ship as her hut, that the boogeyman walked its halls marking names to be crossed out one by one. The whispers carried more weight than orders, because orders came from men and women who trembled in their own voices. Whispers came from the dark, and the dark had never lied. The Empire had always believed its power eternal, a structure so vast and unyielding that nothing could shake its foundations. Its fleets outnumbered the stars in certain skies, its archives stretched across entire moons, and its rulers spoke with the authority of gods. Yet for all its strength, it could not withstand a force it did not understand. It was not weapons or fleets that brought it to its knees. It was fear, and that fear had been born the moment 5 women were taken from a quiet, blue world. The witches and the shadows spread from ship to ship, system to system, carried not through engines or transmitters, but through the minds of those who survived long enough to speak. A rumor is faster than a bullet, and the Empire found itself undone not by battles lost, but by the whispers of soldiers too afraid to fight. They spoke of the cursed humans, of the unborn who dreamed in unison, of Baba Yaga's forest swallowing starships whole, of the boogeyman walking the corridors of war. And though commanders dismissed these accounts as madness, their voices cracked when they spoke. Madness is power when it is shared, and soon entire divisions began to crumble under the weight of invisible terror. Fleets were dispatched to contain what had begun, to cut away the infection before it spread further. They arrived in formation, shields raised, weapons armed, banners displayed proudly as if ritual could banish fear. But when the first salvos were fired into the void, they struck nothing. The targets had already vanished, hidden in a maze of shadows that bent space into shapes no chart could capture. Pilots found themselves flying through forests instead of stars, their navigational systems screaming in confusion, their ships colliding with trees larger than mountains. When their hulls ruptured, no vacuum waited on the other side, only darkness filled with cackling laughter. The survivors swore they saw a crooked hut standing on impossibly tall legs, its windows glowing like eyes, its door yawning open as a hungry. Those who escaped one nightmare fell into another. The boogeyman moved through their fleets like plague through a city. Ships fell silent, their crews erased without battle, their hulls drifting cold and lifeless. Others screamed across open channels before being cut off mid-sentence, their last words always the same: "He is here." Some commanders tried to rally their men, speaking of order and discipline, but even their voices faltered when they realized their personal guard had vanished without trace, leaving only shadows pressed into the walls. The Empire had faced rebellions, uprisings, insurrections across its long history, but never an enemy like this. This was not resistance. This was judgment. The 5 women remained at the center of it all, their bodies heavy with children no longer entirely human. Their bellies swelled beyond natural limits, yet they did not collapse. Instead, their strength grew, their voices deepened, their eyes glowed faintly in the dark. They were not captives anymore. They were vessels, carrying within them the birth of something new. The unborn kicked with rhythms that reverberated through the structure of ships, rattling bulkheads, shaking consoles, echoing like drums of war. Engineers who tried to measure the vibrations could not find their source. The sound came not from within the ship, but from the fabric of reality itself. The Empire grew desperate. Some factions argued for annihilation, to burn the women and their unborn with plasma fire, to erase the source of contagion. Others insisted on containment, believing the power could still be harnessed. Both sides failed, because neither understood that what had been unleashed was no longer bound by flesh. The myths had taken root in reality, and reality itself had begun to shift. Fires burned in the void where no oxygen existed. Footsteps echoed through vacuum. Forests grew where only stars should shine. Death itself had taken a form, and it wore humanity's shadow. The fleet sent to destroy the anomaly did not return. Entire sectors went dark, communication relays falling silent one after another. At first the Empire believed it was sabotage or rebellion, but when scouts arrived, they found only wreckage drifting among the stars, hulls gouged with claw marks, bridges abandoned, engines cold. In some cases, ships were intact, their crews frozen in place. Every face contorted in terror, as though they had all seen the same vision at the same moment. The archives marked these events as malfunctions, as viral outbreaks, as anything but what they truly were. But the lower ranks knew. They whispered the truth in the shadows, the only place it felt safe to speak. Humanity had awakened its nightmares, and the nightmares were stronger than empires. The birth came sooner than expected. The 5 women convulsed in unison, their screams echoing through every deck, carried by no speakers but vibrating through the walls themselves. Soldiers clutched their heads as the sound drilled into their skulls. Lights burst, consoles exploded, engines stuttered and died. From within the chambers came not the cries of infants, but the roars of something older, deeper, more resonant than any child could make. When the birthing was over, silence fell heavy. The women lay still, their bodies broken by what they had delivered, but their faces serene, their eyes shining with the knowledge that they had fulfilled their purpose. What emerged was not ordinary. The newborns were wrapped in flesh and blood, but carried within them the weight of myths given form. Their cries warped gravity. Their eyes glowed in colors unseen before. Their bodies shifted between the fragile appearance of infants and silhouettes that towered like giants in the corner of vision. Those who dared approach were struck blind, their minds overwhelmed by images of forest shadows and endless judgment. The children were not children at all. They were seeds, harbingers of a new era where humanity's fears were no longer confined to campfires and stories, but walked openly among the stars. The Empire could not contain them. Attempts to isolate the newborns failed as reality itself bent to their presence. Weapons fired against them misfired or turned upon their wielders. Explosives detonated before they could be placed. Fields designed to hold suns flickered out like candles in the wind. Wherever the children went, Baba Yaga's laughter followed, and the boogeyman's shadow loomed. The myths no longer needed to be summoned. They were born anew, carried in the blood of the next generation. News of these events reached worlds far beyond the immediate conflict. Subjugated species, long crushed under the Empire's heel, listened with widening eyes. They had always believed the Empire invincible, but now it bled from wounds no fleet could heal. Whispers spread faster than commands. They said the humans had awoken gods, that their children were monsters destined to reshape the galaxy, that Earth was no longer prey but predator. The very name of humanity became a warning. Captains refused to dock on human soil. Governors demanded evacuation from sectors even adjacent to the Blue Planet. Fear had spread beyond soldiers to civilians, beyond soldiers to rulers, beyond rulers to the very heart of the Empire.